All right. Okay. Good morning, guys. So here we are back again talking about budgets. In the first lesson and with the first assignment, you focus mainly on needs and wants. Now, it's really important to consider our needs and wants when it comes time to planning our money and, making adjustments, but most budgets aren't truly separated that way. So we're going to talk about a few other things to think about when discussing and creating budgets. First off, we talked about income and expenses. So income is, of course, based on our wage or our salary, and expenses is outgoing money. Now, when you are an adult and you've got bills and things like that, there's really kind of two general categories of expenses, fixed and variable. Now, fixed expenses are kind of your boring adult, payments. These are items that are going to cost roughly the same amount each month. Okay, they are fixed, they are set. Now, the reason they typically cost the same each month is often because they are bills or loan payments. So when we learned about different loans, many loans like mortgages and cars and personal loans, they're amortized, which means your payments each month are the same, which makes it actually fairly easy to put onto your budget. So things that are fixed are going to be like mortgage or your rent or car payments, insurance payments, cell phone bills, utility bills. So these are kind of one of the first things that you should put into a budget because that they typically have contractual agreements that you have to pay this certain amount each month. Okay, now with your fixed expenses, they're often kind of difficult to cut back on, again, because they're typically contracts. So you might have to cut one of them entirely, like cut out your cable bill, or call the company and renegotiate the price, which is possible with things like cell phone bills, cable bills, internet bills especially. They are typically open for negotiation. Okay, so fixed expenses, they're bills. You pay the same, roughly the same, every month. Then that leaves us with variable expenses. These are things that are typically associated more with wants, but not necessarily. So this, for example, could be like gas for my car. All right. It varies depending on where I'm traveling or what I'm doing, but it's not like really truly a, want. If I have a car, I need gas. So variable expenses are items that are spent where the amount really changes or varies from month to month. Now, even though they are variable and they're not a set amount, it is super important to include these in your budget and to try as hard as possible to estimate a realistic amount. This is where people are going to kind of be off on their budget if they don't really kind of plan this. So I like to be a little bit conservative with my variable expenses. I like to give myself a buffer, and I plan for my variable expenses to be slightly higher than what I might spend, just so that I make sure I'm not in the negative on my budget. So of course it is hard to estimate these, but you have a bit more control. So if you realize that you budgeted $50 for eating out and you're getting close to that, well, you don't have to eat out, okay, typically because it's a want. So variable expenses might be, like I said, eating out with friends, going to a movie for entertainment, going shopping, buying some more clothing, hair care, gifts, things like that. So again, it's really important to be super realistic with these. If, you only budget $100 for something that's going to cost you likely $200, you're not doing yourself any favors. Okay. The point of budgets is to be realistic and create a plan, not for your budget to just be as low as possible and then overspend. So let's take a look at this budget here. Now we know budgets are a plan that has income, which is up there, has savings, and it has expenses. Obviously your expenses is going to be a larger category. Now notice how it's an itemized list. So it's really important that in this column, you actually write what you're spending your money on. That way, if you need to make adjustments to your budget, you know where that money was going. Okay. This particular budget has the budget column, which is the kind of planned expense. Notice how there's an actual column. So typically you'd review back to your budget and you'd fill this in and you'd figure out the difference. So with your budget, again, this is one possibility to break your expenses into fixed and variable. So some people like to do this where all their kind of planned expenses are in one category. Those are going to be set payments, and then they'll plan their variable expenses kind of separately. Notice how the variable expenses typically are, even numbers, right? Because you're just estimating. So you don't need to estimate to the, 62 cents. But the fixed expenses, if your bill is set, that's what it is. Okay. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what I mean by an itemized list and with the kind of budget values. Because again, you're going to be creating your own, another budget. Now with savings, sometimes people leave this out of their budget and they essentially have their income, have their expenses, and if they happen to have money left over, oh, okay, that'll be my savings. That is really not good planning, okay? We talked about this before. It's really important that you set aside in your budget to pay yourself first. So instead of putting my savings at the bottom here, I would have preferred to put that right up by the income. I would plan for at least 20 to 25% savings, and then my spending would be whatever's left over, right? Because you don't want to spend your savings. So it's really important to build this right into your budget and not just save what's left over. So truly, you should kind of take your net income, subtract your planned savings, and then that leaves you with your spending money for your fixed and variable expenses. Now, again, just a reminder, we've also talked within your savings that it's a good idea to have separate accounts and separate kind of plan for that savings money. So you might have a separate kind of category for emergency fund savings, short-term savings, and some long-term savings. But that can be just based off of your own bank accounts. It doesn't necessarily have to be allocated in your budget. Now, when it comes time to budgeting, there's not really one set way. There's lots of advice out there and how to kind of know whether you're meeting general targets, but it really comes down to your income and your lifestyle. So one of the common suggestions with budgeting is the 50-30-20 rule, okay? I do want you to be familiar with this because it's just good guidelines to kind of live by. This budget plan indicates that 50% of your money will go to kind of needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to savings. Now, of course, you could just adjust those numbers slightly, but that's a good target to be aware of. Now, other models will break that down into a bit more categories. This would be my preference. I really like my budget to be more categorized, as opposed to just fixed and variable. I like my expenses to be broken down into housing, transportation, health and beauty, other categories, so that I can truly see if there's an area in my life I'm overspending on. It should be important that you kind of know these targets as well, where at least 20 to 25% is on savings. Now, notice how if you have debt, that's what this is here. If you have debt, you should be, making sure that that's a priority as opposed to just saving all of your money. Because typically debt means you're paying interest, and oftentimes the interest you owe is higher than the savings. But it's still going to be important that not all of your money is going to debt because you want to make sure you still have an emergency fund. Now, no more than 35% should be going to housing. No more than 15% should be going to anything related to transportation. That includes, it's not just a car or a car payment. It includes maintenance, gas, insurance, everything related. That leaves you with roughly 25 to 30% for other expenses. So it's a good idea to kind of budget and then see whether your budget is fitting within those percentages. Okay, now let's talk about how would we start budgeting. Again, there's not really one correct way to do this, but this is just kind of advice on how to get started. So first off, when you want to start budgeting, you need to determine what money you have. Not everybody knows what they actually make in a month necessarily. So it's really important that you are budgeting off of your net income. So as we know, lots of money gets deducted from CPP, income taxes, and EI, and it's really important that you consider that. So you don't have to include your gross pay in your deductions. Often that's just ignored, but you do need to make sure you're starting with your net income at least. So of course your net pay is equal to your gross pay, subtract any deductions. Okay, once you know what your money you have what to work with, second, I would recommend to set aside those savings right off the bat. All right, so calculate at least, I would calculate 20% of that net income. So remember, let's say, whatever that number is, if I'm calculating 20%, I'm multiplying by 0.2. Okay, that will give me my savings, and I would just automatically budget that. Okay, if you want that number to be 25, 30%, you can do that. Ideally, when you're younger, that number should be higher, right? If you don't have a lot of bills and utilities and mortgages and things like that, try and save as much as possible when you're younger. And again, notice, that savings, if you do have debt that you're paying interest on, start paying that off first, okay? All right, you have your income, you've set aside some money for savings. Next would be to look at your fixed expenses. Now, you can still have this broken into categories, but start kind of filling in any fixed expenses that you have essentially contractual payments on. So this is where I would fill in my mortgage, and I would fill in, some of my utility bills, and I would fill in, car insurance and all of that. Because I know that I have to find money for those each month, or else I'm essentially defaulting payments. Once you're done that, then you need to plan, not just kind of assume, plan your variable expenses. So to figure out how much money you have here, take your net pay, subtract your savings, subtract your fixed expenses, and that leaves you with the money that you can allocate for everything else. So it is really important, again, that you estimate as realistically as possible. So fill in categories like, don't ignore things like entertainment. It's pretty unlikely for most people to go a full month without spending anything on movies, eating out, snacks, Slurpees, coffee. So even though they're wants and you could live without them, it's really important that you plan that you likely will spend some amount, okay? So it's really important that you are realistic in this category. Once you have all your planning done, after your budget was essentially complete, you would then come back and compare your actual spending habits. Okay, so you have a set budget, then it's really important to actually go through your credit card statements, your bank account statements, your debit card statements, and see what you're actually spending, right? If you don't do this step and your actual spending is just constantly more than your budget, then your budget's not doing anything good, right? It can't just sit there, you have to actually look at it. So if you find that you need to make adjustments to your budget, step number one, or kind of the first suggestion, would be to really look at your variable expenses, right? Because these aren't set payments, it's the easiest place to start to think about where you can cut back. Then you'd want to look at your fixed expenses, see if you could live without one of those payments, like for example, a Netflix subscription. After that, if you can't find anywhere that you can cut, if you're already living on bare bones, then it's time to start thinking about increasing your income. Start thinking about picking up more hours, start thinking about, getting a small part-time job, something like that. Okay. Now, then it's time as life progresses to reevaluate your budget. Okay. The budget that you create when you first move out of home is not going to work for your entire life. It's going to change, right? As you own versus rent a home, as you're living alone versus living with a roommate, kids versus no kids, etc. So budgets need to change as our lives change. Now, like I said, budgets, there's not really one way to do it. Some people prefer pen and paper. Some people, mostly do them on computer now. You can use Excel. You can have it fill in formulas. But whatever you do, it's just important that you do it. Okay, plan your expenses and then revisit them. So this is just another